From the windswept steppes of Mongolia rose one of history's most fearsome powers, the Mongol Empire. In the early 13th century, a tribal leader named Temujin, later known as Genghis Khan, united the fractious Mongol clans. Through his vision, discipline, and ruthless tactics, the Mongols created the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever seen, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. The Mongols were unlike any empire before them. Their strength lay not in great cities or castles, but in mobility, discipline, and strategy. Their armies, mounted on horseback, could move faster and strike harder than any enemy. They mastered the use of composite bows, siege warfare, and psychological terror, defeating armies far larger than their own. But it was not just brutality. Genghis Khan also established laws, promoted trade, and built a network of communication across Eurasia. At its height, the Mongol Empire controlled lands from China to Persia, Russia to the Middle East. It opened the Silk Road, spreading goods, ideas, and technologies across continents. Yet, the same vastness that made it powerful also sowed the seeds of its downfall. After Genghis Khan's death, the empire fractured into separate khanates: the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. Each developed its own identity, and unity faded. By the 14th century, the Mongols were no longer the unstoppable force they once were. Internal rivalries, assimilation into local cultures, and powerful enemies slowly dismantled their empire. Yet their legacy lived on. The Mongols had reshaped the map of the world, connected distant civilizations, and left behind a legacy of both fear and innovation. The rise and fall of the Mongol Empire is not just the story of conquest. It is the story of how nomadic horsemen changed the course of history. On the vast, endless steppes of Mongolia, where the winds howl across the grasslands and life is a constant struggle for survival, a boy was born who would one day change the course of history. His name was Temujin, but the world would remember him as Genghis Khan, the greatest conqueror of all time. Yet, his story did not begin with power or glory. It began with hardship, betrayal, and the desperate fight to survive. Temujin was born around 1162 into a world of warring tribes. His father, a tribal leader, was poisoned by rivals when Temujin was still a boy. With his father gone, the family was abandoned by their own clan and left to fend for themselves in the unforgiving wilderness. Temujin's mother struggled to keep her children alive, gathering roots, berries, and whatever food they could find. Hunger, cold, and fear became a part of their daily lives. This harsh childhood shaped Temujin in ways no comfort ever could. He learned resilience, self-reliance, and the brutal reality of power. He understood that loyalty could not be assumed. It had to be earned and enforced. As he grew, he faced betrayal even from those closest to him. At one point, he was captured and enslaved by a rival clan. But Temujin escaped, vowing never again to be at the mercy of others. Slowly, he began to gather followers, not through wealth or noble birth, but through charisma, courage, and the promise of a better future. Unlike other tribal leaders, Temujin rewarded loyalty and ability rather than family ties. He broke the old system of aristocratic privilege, choosing commanders based on merit. To his people, this was revolutionary. To his enemies, it was dangerous. By his 20s, Temujin had already proven himself as a skilled warrior and leader. He forged alliances, married Berte, who became not just his wife, but his partner in leadership, and began to unify the fractured Mongol tribes. This was no small feat. The Mongols had long been divided, locked in endless cycles of feuds and betrayals. But Temujin brought discipline where chaos reigned. He introduced laws known as the Yasa and demanded loyalty above all else. Those who defied him faced ruthless punishment. Those who followed him were rewarded with protection and wealth. Step by step, he transformed scattered tribes into a single force. Battles were fought, victories were won, and his reputation grew. His enemies learned to fear his cunning. His allies learned to trust his vision. In 1206, after years of struggle and bloodshed, Temujin's dream became reality. At a great council of Mongol leaders, he was declared Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. The outcast boy had become the master of the steppe. But becoming Khan was only the beginning. Genghis Khan did not see the Mongol tribes as an end. He saw them as the foundation of something far greater. His gaze turned outward beyond the steppes toward the rich civilizations of China, Persia, and beyond. Where others saw borders, Genghis Khan saw opportunity. Where others built walls, he sent his riders to tear them down. The rise of Genghis Khan was not inevitable. It was forged through hunger, pain, and betrayal. Yet, those very struggles gave him the strength to endure and the wisdom to lead. He was not born into greatness, he carved it with blood and fire. From outcast to conqueror, his journey was a testament to the power of vision and the will to overcome any obstacle. And so, from the windswept plains of Mongolia, a new empire was born, an empire that would stretch farther and last longer than anyone could have imagined. The boy who had once been abandoned and enslaved would soon make kings and emperors tremble at the mention of his name, Genghis Khan. When the Mongols rode into battle, they carried with them more than bows and arrows. They carried fear itself. For their enemies, facing the Mongols was like facing a storm that could not be stopped. Behind their victories was not only courage, but a genius for strategy and the ruthless use of terror as a weapon of war. At the heart of the Mongol war machine was the horse. Every Mongol warrior owned several, switching mounts to keep them fresh, allowing the army to move at incredible speed. Their mobility was unmatched. Mongol armies could travel up to 70 miles in a single day, striking with lightning force before their enemies could even prepare. This ability to appear suddenly and vanish just as quickly gave them an almost supernatural reputation. Their weapon of choice was the composite bow, small enough to be used on horseback but powerful enough to pierce armor at great distances. Each warrior could fire arrows with deadly accuracy while galloping at full speed. In battle, they rained arrows down on their enemies, weakening them before closing in for the kill. Against such precision and mobility, traditional armies, slow and heavily armored, stood little chance. But weapons alone did not make the Mongols invincible. It was their organization and discipline that truly set them apart. Genghis Khan structured his army into units of tens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s. Each soldier knew his place, each commander knew his role. Orders were clear and absolute, and disobedience meant death. In a world where many armies were little more than mobs, the Mongols fought with the precision of a machine. Perhaps their most feared tactic was the feigned retreat. Mongol warriors would pretend to panic and flee, luring enemies into pursuit. Once their foes were scattered and overextended, the Mongols would turn suddenly and strike with devastating force. Time and again, enemies fell into this trap, only to find themselves surrounded and destroyed. But the Mongols did not rely on battlefield tactics alone. They mastered the art of psychological warfare. Genghis Khan understood that terror could be more powerful than swords. Cities that resisted were utterly destroyed, their populations slaughtered or enslaved. Survivors were left alive only to spread tales of Mongol cruelty. Entire regions surrendered without a fight, simply to avoid the fate they had heard whispered from fleeing refugees. Fear itself became an army that marched ahead of the Mongols, weakening their enemies before a single arrow was fired. The Mongols also embraced innovation. Though born of the steppe, they learned siege warfare from captured engineers and quickly mastered it. They built catapults, trebuchets, and even early forms of gunpowder weapons. No fortress was safe. In China, they adapted to walled cities. In Persia, they used terror to break resistance. In Europe, they brought devastation deep into Hungary and Poland. Wherever they rode, they adapted, learned, and conquered. Yet their genius was not only in destruction. Genghis Khan valued intelligence as much as strength. He created a network of spies and scouts that provided him with information about enemy movements, terrain, and weaknesses. With this knowledge, he struck where his enemies were weakest and avoided battles he could not win. Strategy, speed, and precision, these were the true weapons of the Mongol Empire. To their enemies, the Mongols were demons on horseback, merciless and unstoppable. But to the Mongols themselves, they were warriors chosen by destiny, united under a single leader and driven by a vision of conquest. Every tactic, every act of terror, every victory was part of a larger design, to make the Mongols not just a tribe, but the rulers of the world. And for a time, that design succeeded. Kingdoms crumbled, empires fell, and the Mongols carved their name into history as the masters of war. Their tactics of terror were more than brutality. They were a deliberate strategy, one that turned fear into the sharpest blade of all. Once Genghis Khan had united the Mongol tribes under his banner, the steppes were no longer enough. His gaze turned outward toward the empires and kingdoms that lay beyond the grasslands. For centuries, the Mongols had been dismissed as mere nomads, raiders with no lasting power. But under Genghis Khan, they became a storm that swept across the world. What began as tribal unification soon became the greatest conquest in human history. The first target was China. To the south, the wealthy kingdom of the Jin dynasty held vast cities, walls, and riches. For generations, the Jin had looked down on the Mongols, demanding tribute and treating them as barbarians. Genghis Khan would not forget such humiliation. In 1211, he launched his invasion. His cavalry swarmed across northern China, overwhelming armies many times their size. By 1215, Beijing itself fell to the Mongols, a city of stone and silk, brought low by horsemen from the steppe. But Genghis Khan did not stop with the Jin. He turned westward, his ambition stretching across deserts and mountains. In 1219, the Khwarezmian Empire of Persia became his next target. The spark was an insult. Mongol envoys were killed by the Shah of Khwarezm. For Genghis Khan, this was unforgivable. His response was swift and merciless. The Mongols poured into Central Asia, destroying city after city. Samarkand, Bukhara, and Urgench, centers of trade and culture, were reduced to rubble. The Shah fled in terror, leaving his empire to collapse in flames. From there, the Mongol armies split, moving like rivers across the land. Some swept into the Caucasus, defeating Georgian and Armenian kingdoms. Others marched into Russia, crushing the princes who resisted. Entire armies vanished before the Mongol storm. Wherever the great Khan's banners appeared, terror followed. By the time of Genghis Khan's death in 1227, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. It was the largest empire ever created in a single lifetime. But the expansion did not end with him. His successors carried his vision further. Under his son, Ogadai, the Mongols struck deep into Europe. They invaded Poland and Hungary in the 1240s, defeating knights and kings with the same tactics that had crushed Asia. The Battle of Mohi in Hungary showed the world that even Europe's armored cavalry could not withstand Mongol speed and strategy. By the time Mongol scouts reached the gates of Vienna, Europe itself trembled with fear. In the east, Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, completed the conquest of China, overthrowing the Song dynasty in 1279. He established the Yuan dynasty and ruled as Emperor of China. Under his reign, the Mongol Empire reached its cultural and economic peak, linking East Asia to the Middle East and Europe through trade and diplomacy. The Silk Road flourished under Mongol protection, carrying goods, knowledge, and ideas across continents. The empire's expansion was not merely military, it reshaped the very map of the world. Cities rose and fell, borders vanished, and cultures collided. From Persia to China, from Russia to India, no region was untouched by Mongol influence. For some, it was devastation. For others, it was opportunity, as trade flourished and connections between distant lands grew stronger than ever before. At its height, the Mongol Empire stretched across more than 24 million square kilometers, larger than Rome, larger than Alexander's conquests, larger than any empire the world had ever known. It was not just an empire of land, it was an empire of fear, power, and ambition. Yet even as it reached its greatest extent, the seeds of its future decline were already being sown. The vastness that made it mighty also made it fragile. Communication stretched thin, rivalries between heirs began to grow, and unity weakened. But in the 13th century, in the age of Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongols were unstoppable. And the expansion of the Great Khanate was the story of how nomads from the steppe carved their names across the face of the earth. to the outside world. The Mongols were known as destroyers, riders who brought death and terror wherever they went. But within the empire, life under Mongol rule was far more complex. Behind the blood and fire, there was order, justice, and even opportunity. The Great Khan did not build his empire on fear alone. He built it on laws, systems, and a vision of unity that stretched across nations and cultures. At the heart of this vision was the Yasa, the great law code of Genghis Khan. Though parts of it remain shrouded in mystery, its principles are clear. It demanded loyalty, punished betrayal, and ensured discipline. Theft, adultery, and betrayal of the Khan's trust could mean death. But Yasa also protected the weak, enforced religious tolerance, and rewarded loyalty and merit. Under its rule, even the poorest herdsman could rise through the ranks of the army if he proved his courage and skill. For ordinary people, life in the Mongol Empire was harsh but predictable. The steppes remained the homeland of the Mongols, where herders lived in circular felt tents called yurts, moving with their animals across the vast grasslands. Horses, sheep, and goats were the lifeblood of their existence, providing food, clothing, and transport. Even as the empire expanded into great cities, the Mongols themselves never lost their love of the open steppe and the freedom it represented. Yet within the empire's cities, life was transformed. Trade routes flourished under Mongol protection, especially the legendary Silk Road. Merchants could travel from China to Europe more safely than ever before, carrying silk, spices, glass, and precious metals. The Mongols valued commerce, often exempting traders from taxes and protecting caravans with military patrols. The empire became a bridge between East and West, a place where cultures met and exchanged ideas as much as goods. Religion, too, found an unusual place in Mongol society. The Mongols themselves followed shamanistic traditions, worshipping the eternal blue sky. But Genghis Khan and his successors enforced religious tolerance. Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, and others were free to practice their faiths within the empire. Priests, monks, and scholars were often given tax exemptions, a sharp contrast to the brutal wars the Mongols waged outside their borders. This tolerance helped stabilize the diverse lands they ruled, bringing a degree of peace to conquered peoples. Law and order were enforced with ruthless efficiency. Messengers could travel across the empire using the Yam system, a network of stations with fresh horses and supplies. Messages and goods could cross thousands of miles faster than in any other civilization of the time. This system not only tied the empire together, but also allowed the Khan to maintain control over vast territories. Daily life under Mongol rule depended on one's position. For the Mongol elite, life was filled with riches, palaces, fine clothing, exotic goods brought from all corners of the empire. For common soldiers, life was one of constant readiness, moving with armies, training, and fighting. For peasants and conquered peoples, it often meant paying tribute or providing labor, though many found Mongol rule less oppressive than that of their previous lords. Justice was harsh but fair. Corrupt officials could be executed, generals who failed in their duties faced death, and even members of the royal family were not above the law. Genghis Khan believed that an empire could not survive without order, and order required discipline. The Yasa was not a suggestion. It was the backbone of Mongol power. Despite their reputation as destroyers, the Mongols were also builders of systems. They created a vast empire where laws applied across borders, where trade flowed freely, and where knowledge traveled from one civilization to another. It was a paradox. The same warriors who burned cities to ash also created one of the most stable and connected societies of the medieval world. For those who lived within its borders, the Mongol Empire was not only a place of fear, it was also a place of opportunity, order, and surprising tolerance. Life and law under the Great Khan were not simple, but they were powerful enough to bind together the largest empire the world had ever seen. When the thunder of Mongol hooves finally faded, the world that remained was forever changed. The Mongol Empire did not last forever, but its impact stretched across centuries, shaping nations, economies, and cultures in ways that still echo today. The legacy of the Mongols is a story of both destruction and creation, of terror and transformation. One of their greatest legacies was the sheer size of their empire. At its height, it stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe, the largest contiguous empire in human history. For the first time, vast regions of the world were connected under a single rule. This connection reshaped global trade and communication in ways never seen before. The Silk Road, once dangerous and fragmented, flourished under Mongol protection. Merchants could travel from China to Europe more safely than ever before, guarded by Mongol patrols and supported by a network of stations across the empire. This allowed not just goods, like silk, spices, and precious metals, to move across continents, but also ideas, technologies, and even diseases. Paper, gunpowder, and printing traveled westward, while art, science, and medicine from the Islamic world moved eastward. In many ways, the Mongols created the first era of global exchange. But their legacy was not only in trade, it was in governance. Genghis Khan's system of meritocracy, where leaders were chosen for ability rather than birth, influenced later political thought. His laws, the Yasa, created a foundation of order that stretched across cultures. Even in conquered lands, many rulers adopted Mongol systems of taxation, administration, and communication. Religious tolerance was another unexpected legacy. At a time when much of the world was torn by religious conflict, the Mongols allowed Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, and others to practice their faiths. This policy not only kept the empire stable but also encouraged cultural exchange. Scholars, monks, and traders carried their beliefs and knowledge across the empire, enriching the civilizations that came after. Yet the Mongol legacy also carries a darker side. Their campaigns of conquest left cities in ruins and populations destroyed. Baghdad, once the jewel of the Islamic world, was reduced to ash in 1258 when Hulagu Khan's forces sacked the city. Entire cultures were wiped out, and the memory of Mongol cruelty still lingers in many histories. To their enemies, the Mongols were remembered as destroyers who brought an age of suffering. Still, even the destruction carried long-term consequences. By toppling great empires and kingdoms, the Mongols cleared the way for new powers to rise. The collapse of old systems allowed the spread of fresh ideas and the birth of new states. In Russia, Mongol domination shaped political structures for centuries, influencing the rise of Moscow as a powerful state. In China, Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty laid the foundation for future unification under the Ming. Culturally, the Mongols became bridges between worlds. They did not erase the civilizations they conquered, but often absorbed and connected them. Their courts welcomed scholars, engineers, and artists from every corner of the empire. Even Europe felt their influence. Marco Polo's journey to China was made possible by Mongol rule, and his stories helped spark Europe's later age of exploration. Perhaps the greatest legacy of all was the idea of empire itself. The Mongols proved that it was possible to rule across vast distances, to connect different peoples under one authority, and to maintain order over lands larger than anyone had imagined. Though the empire eventually fractured into separate khanates, each carried forward the Mongol tradition in its own way. From the Golden Horde in Russia to the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Yuan dynasty in China. By the time the Mongol Empire faded, the world had been reshaped. Borders, trade, cultures, and even warfare had been transformed. They were remembered as both destroyers and unifiers, feared as conquerors, but respected as builders of the first truly global empire. The legacy of the Mongols is not one of simple conquest. It is the story of how nomads from the steppes forced the world into a new age of connection, how they brought terror but also transformation. The echoes of their empire still resound in our history, reminding us that even the most unlikely of people can leave a mark on the world that never fades.